There's one good thing about Facebook. Maybe only one. There's a little button that says memories. And you can go back years and years and years, and you can see where you were and what you were doing and who you were with and what you looked like years ago. And it's important, I think, for us to remember where we have been so we can see where we have come to. And with Esther chapter 7, we're going to see Esther make this really big decision that I just want to back up a little bit and let's look at where she has been. Okay, as we've gone through these few chapters of Esther so far, we've seen this girl who was an orphan and adopted, that was taken against her will, somewhere between the ages of, some people believe that she was 14, some people believe she was in her mid-20s, so somewhere in the marrying age, she was taken against her will. She was put in a room and given beauty treatments and essential oils for a year to decide what would happen with the rest of her life. And she would either become the queen or she would be single for the rest of her life. There were only two options at that point for Esther. She hid her identity for years. Mordecai said, "Don't let them know you're a Jew until it's convenient for you. Live in a way, be the queen, and oh, by the way, you're going to go through a little bit of time where the king is going to kind of forget about you. So you're the queen, but you're a Jew, but you have this identity crisis, and the king isn't going to invite you into his presence for at least 30 days. And then, if you're Esther, you're going to be asked to do something that is harder and more difficult than you've ever done in your entire life. Go, you have to save us. You have to be the hero of our country. You have to be the person, the knight in shining armor. You have to do what nobody has ever done before. You have to be our Redeemer. And I know that it might cost you your life. And so Esther walks into the throne room and says, and just walks into the king's presence. And remember, we talked about that you would either get the scepter or you would get the hatchet right away. And so she found favor, and the king listened to her, and she invited her into a banquet. And the amount of stress that had to be, but the amount of stress that her whole life had in order for her to be on God's mission was enormous. And she had come from this little young lady who was nobody, no identity, nothing more than an orphan that was adopted to be the queen that was going to save God's people. And let me just remind you this morning that when you are on mission, when you're doing what you're supposed to do, there are things that will get in the way. There are enemy type things in our lives that we mistake for the enemy. And so we're going to look at Esther chapter 7, and we're going to look at Esther call out the enemy. And I think that it's important for us to learn that we need to call out the enemy. We need to recognize the enemy for who the enemy is and not the symptoms of what the enemy brings into our lives. So here's our main idea for this morning. God's people ought to recognize the enemy is around us without allowing him to be influential. God's people ought to recognize the enemy is around us without allowing him to be influential in our lives. And it doesn't take much for us to sit around a room with a cup of coffee and some dessert and talk about all the ways that we feel like Satan has beat us up over the years. Individually, as a family, as a church, as a county, as a country, as an organized religion, all of it. We know there's an enemy. We know that his mission is to destroy us. Our job is to combat that mission. So let's read chapter 7. Esther chapter 7 says this. So the king, remember there was a banquet, and now there's going to be a second banquet. So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther, and on the second day at the banquet of wine, the king again said to Esther, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you, and what is your request? Up to half the kingdom it shall be done." Then Queen Esther answered and said, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king..." Okay, I'm just going to stop there for a minute. How many times in our lives do we need to be reminded that God is listening? And how many times in our lives do we need to be reminded that God really has favor in our lives? If I have found favor. I know you just told me yesterday that I have favor and I can ask anything, but do I have your favor today? God's favor never runs dry. The king is always giving. If I have found favor in your sight, O king, if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. We have been sold as male. Had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss. So King Xerxes answered and said to Queen Esther, "Who is he? And where is he who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing?" And Esther said, "The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman." So Haman was terrified before the king and queen. Then the king arose in his wrath from the banquet. I mean, you would do the same thing. Then the king arose in his wrath from the banquet of wine and went into the palace garden. But Haman stood before Queen Esther, pleading for his life, for he saw the evil was determined against him by the king. When the king returned from the palace garden to the place of the banquet of wine, Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was. Then the king said, "Will you also assault the queen while I am in the house?" As the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Now Harbona, one of the eunuchs, said to the king, "Look, the gallows, 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf, is standing at the house of Haman." Then the king said, "Hang him on it." I'm sure not that nicely. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's wrath was subsided. In the first six verses, we're going to look at, we need to recognize the enemy and the mission and his mission for our lives. Recognize the enemy. It's easy for us to see in these verses who's the enemy. Who is the enemy? And I'm going to suggest to you that the enemy looks different to Esther than it does the king. So let's look at these verses. In verse 3, verse 2, on the second day at the banquet of wine, the king again said to Esther, "What's your petition? It shall be granted you. And what is your petition? Up to half the kingdom, it shall be done." I just have to say, I think Haman's nervous at that right there. Well, this person's going to get, the queen is going to get anything she wants. And I know that she knows she's a Jew. I have seen her and Mordecai talking. I've seen their friendship. I've seen them fast for 3 days. I've seen them conspiring against me. Not really, but that's what he thinks. Because if you're not for him, you're against him. He knows that Queen Esther and Mordecai are in some sort of thing. He's seen it all around the street. At this point in the story, it seems like the king is really the only person that doesn't know Esther is a Jew. And so I think right at the front, Haman is a little nervous. Verse 3, then Queen Esther answered and said, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition and my people at my request." Always remember, the best request for your life is to be saved. The best request is to be saved. Let my life be given to me at my petition. There are people in this room that need to be saved spiritually. There are people in this room, there are people that we know that need to be saved physically. Their life is a mess. Their life is in shambles. They're making decisions against the betterment of themselves. They need to be saved from, sometimes I need to be saved from myself. Sometimes I can be my own worst enemy, and sometimes you can be your own worst enemy. Sometimes to be saved, to have our life redeemed, is the best request. Verse 4, "For we have been sold for my people and I to be destroyed, to be killed, to be annihilated." This person, my enemy, the person that I'm going to mention, is my enemy because they want to destroy me. They have paid. Remember, Haman offered the equivalent of $15 million to destroy, kill, and annihilate this entire race. The enemy is, this person has paid a certain amount of money to kill me. That's why this person is my enemy. Had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss. So let's just think about that for a minute. How much money did Haman offer the king? $15 million, 10,000 pieces of silver, something like that. The equivalent of $15 million. This race being removed was worth more to the king than $15 million. They had set up shop. They were business people. They were entrepreneurs. They were stimulating the economy of the Persian Empire. They were bringing it. They were contributors to society. Take out the entire race in 127 provinces, and removing them would have cost the king more than $15 million. $15 million is nothing in God's eyes. So I love the king's response to this. So King Xerxes answered and said to the queen, "Who is he? Where is he Who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing? I know I might be reading into this a little bit, but I don't think that he's talking about Esther being killed. I think he's talking about the money. I think the enemy is the person that is going to do harm to the king's riches. There's one enemy, and one enemy to Esther is going to kill and destroy and annihilate. The same enemy pointed at King Xerxes is going to cap my wealth. So I think it's important for us to remember, who is the enemy? We already know. Who's the enemy? Haman is the enemy in the context. Who is our enemy? Satan. And just like Haman is the enemy in different ways in our story, in our text, Satan plays out different roles in our lives. Satan might a diagnosis of the enemy's attack on somebody might be alcohol, might be drunkenness, it might be gambling, it might be eating too much sweets, it might be too much coffee, it can be any number of things in our lives. That the enemy knows us well and knows how to attack us individually. And Satan might attack me, most likely will attack me differently than he will attack you. Because Satan isn't finished until he thinks that we can be destroyed, killed, annihilated. And the enemy looks different. Just like Haman is attacking different areas of this because he wants the power. He wants the power. Who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing? Verse 6, Esther said, the adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. I mean, picture this. Just picture this for a minute, guys. The three of them are sitting at a table. Not like you walk into my dining room and there is a table that we've had for 20 years and there's 6 chairs around it and we're sitting at the chair. They have more like, it probably looks more like a coffee table. And they're on the floor and their feet are in each other's spaces and they're trying to just be themselves, and they're kind of leaning back and they're on their elbow and they are relaxing well, but they're in everyone's eyesight and they're sitting on the floor. So the king's here and the queen's here and Haman's here and they're sitting around, and the wicked Haman, it's him. It's like, so she is pointing across the table, everything that she has, because everything is riding on her defeating the enemy. In order to defeat the enemy, she has to recognize the enemy and his mission. It's him. He's the one that wants to kill my entire people. He's the one that's going to destroy your wealth. And he's the person you made in charge of everything except you. Be careful that we don't give more room to the enemy in our lives than what we need to. Here's our second point. Verse 7 through 10. Make decisions. Anyone make a decision today? You got out of bed. You made a decision today. You took a shower. Hopefully, you made another decision. You put on clean clothing. Hopefully. We make decisions all the time. Make decisions that do not allow the enemy to remain influential in our lives. Esther knew really, really clearly that she had to make decisions that did not allow Haman to remain. So the king arose in his wrath. None of us, this is only in the Bible, none of us have ever left a room mad. Right? Thank you. Then the king arose in his wrath from the banquet of wine and went into the palace garden. But Haman stood before Queen Esther, pleading for his life. For he saw the evil was determined against him by the king. When the king returned from the palace garden to the place of the banquet of wine, Haman had fallen across the table, across the couch where Esther was. Then the king said, "Will he also assault the queen while I'm in the house?" If you happen to read the NIV, that word assault will say molest, because it is believed. So let me give you kind of the background of this whole, of what's going on when the king leaves the room. Haman and Queen Esther are there. It was against the law for a man to come within 7 steps of anyone in the king's harem. Social distancing at its finest. It's actually a century-old practice, and we never knew it until 18 months ago. 7 steps. You could not come within 7 steps of anyone in the queen's harem. And you could never be in a room alone with someone in the queen's harem. And so when the king walked out, Haman actually should have walked out with him. You're like, how many of you want to walk out with the person that's mad at you? Like, awkward. There's nowhere for him to go. He can walk out with the king, who is pretty irate with him at the moment. He can stay in the room. Either way, he's in trouble. Between a rock and a hard place. There is no right for him, no right place for him to go. Now, so I have to kind of think, I wonder, if part of the conversation while the king is in the garden, how can I punish Haman for something that I approved? It's kind of like your kids do, or your grandkids do something that you're laughing at, and then you have to punish them for it. Maybe that only happens in my house. Anyone that ever happened to any? So I think it's kind of one of those scenarios. How can I just signed off on this? How can I punish him? And so there's tension going on, I think, even in the king's conversation about what's going on, until he walks back in the room. Until he walks back in the room and he sees that Haman is still there. And the text says, Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was. Scholars believe that he was trying to schmooze Esther into saying, no, that's I know you wanted to kill us, Haman, but it's okay, you can stay. You can just stay alive. And some scholars believe that Haman was giving Esther a foot massage, so to speak. So guys, your wife always wants foot massages. Always. Some are like, no, I don't want you ever to touch my feet. So there you go. But so he thinks he reads into the situation, and he says, will you even assault the queen while I'm in the house? Will you molest her? Will you try to take advantage of my queen while I'm even present? Why would you even do such a thing? And it goes on and he says, So there's kind of in the English, it doesn't really give us a great continuation here. We have verse 8. Really, there's this pause where something else is going on. Will he also assault the queen while I'm in the house? And then the next line is, as the word left the king's mouth. The word is not the question to Haman. The word is the death sentence. Get him out of here. If you show this video to the VeggieTales video of this story to your grandkids or your children, my children still like to watch this. It will say, send him to the island of perpetual tickling. Get him out of here. He's done. I've seen enough. He's trying to squelch my wealth, and now he's trying to take advantage of my queen. I don't care whatever else he's done. I don't care what else he did. He's done at that point. There's nothing. You cannot save yourself from that moment. So let me say a couple things about this. They take him out. Harbona is the same guy in chapter 1 that is in the group of people that say, well, you need to cast this throughout the entire 127 provinces so we can tell our wives everything exactly what to do. The guy's kind of, shady. He definitely has his own agenda going on, but he says, hey, there just happened to be these gallows that Haman was making for Mordecai, the guy that you just gave a big parade to yesterday. And they're not being used, and there has to be a conversation that we don't have. And the king says, hang him. Hang him. 75 feet tall. Most theologians believe that 75 feet tall was so it was visible in the entire city. The entire city of Susa would have seen the person being hanged on that. Talk about an example. What if we treated the enemy like that in our own lives? I'm going to hang that which the enemy likes to be a public example for all to see. I am finished with it. That sin that we just keep letting hang around in our lives, what if we publicly hung it on gallows that everyone knew? I'm done with that thing. I'm done with that. I'm done with that thing, whatever that thing is. See, here there are a couple important things that we have to understand. For Haman, execution was required. If Haman had survived, he might recover. He might regain his stamina. He might regain his ground. He might convince the king that even though that was just a little setback. That I have a friend who had a minor stroke about a year and a half ago that he just calls that an incident. I call it a minor stroke. Sometimes we have to call things that which they are, and if we give an enemy a little bit of room, that enemy will keep pushing its way in, and keep pushing its way in, and keep pushing its way in. I heard a story one time about a guy who walked into a church, and there was a piano on one side of the stage. This story is not about me. And he wanted the piano moved. And so And he moved it one week, and somebody came in and they just complained. My grandma put that piano there 50 years ago. It has never moved. And so they put, he was kind of pressured into putting it back where it was. And he said, I'm just going to move this piano an inch every week. An inch every week. And so he would move it. I don't know how he did it. So he just moved the piano an inch. The piano used to be here. So he would move it an inch and an inch. And this guy didn't have to go around a stage to get it into another place. He just was trying to push it along. So every week he would move the piano an inch. And after about a year and a half, he got the piano where he wanted it, and nobody even realized that it had moved. Because if you give something an inch, you might as well give it a mile. And so for the enemy, he had to be executed. And I want to remind us this morning, our enemies want to stick around. Our enemies want to stick around. They want us to accept them. And I'm not talking about the physical enemies that might be in our lives. I'm not talking about the people that you avoid at the grocery store, the family reunion that you don't go to because that person is there, the person that you ghost, the person that you're friends with on your Facebook account but you unfollow because you don't want them to know that you're not friends anymore. I'm not talking about those types of scenarios. I'm talking about the enemy, the roaring lion who seeks to devour you. That enemy wants to find a place that he can creep in, set up camp, stick around, and convince you to accept him. Convince you to accept him, because over time, I've been doing that for a while. It seems to be working for me. Inside I'm a mess, but I'll learn to live with it. I'll learn to live with it. It's kind of like the old pair of shoes. Anyone have an old pair of shoes they love? And you know you need to get rid of them, but you don't because they're so comfortable. Until you go for a few mile walk and you realize they're hurting your feet. The old shoes that hurt our feet need to go because we know the importance of our keeping our feet. The enemy needs to not be given room in our lives because the enemy is hurting us. The enemy would have kept trying to hurt the Jewish nation had he stuck around. He would not have given up until he won. Remember, this was a century-old feud that had been going on. The Hatfield and the McCoys over and over and over. And so, I would like you to consider this morning, what are the openings that you have given the enemy in your life? What are the things in your life that you have just left a crack for the enemy to get in? And the enemy has taken that crack and just nudged it a little bit. And now the enemy has set up shop. And he's there and you know it. You know that it has to go and you're like, I'm just going to kind of live with it for a while because, no, it's hurting you. It's hurting you. It has to be removed just like Haman had to be removed from the story. So the Holy Spirit can win in your life and in mine. Again, we know the rest of Esther. We know this story. We know that Mordecai is exonerated and given the promotion he should have been given a long time ago. take that and look at your life. What are the parts of your life that God is just waiting to promote and exonerate, but you're letting the enemy get in the way? And maybe you're not even, maybe you're in this room and you're not even a Christian. Maybe you have just rejected the truth of Jesus Christ, and maybe you are like, maybe you're the person that the enemy is just totally camped out on, and you're miserable. And you're miserable, and you don't know how to get a fresh start. And I want to say today to you that the only way to get a fresh start is to submit to Jesus Christ. The only way. Maybe the enemy is tearing into your life and you are a Christian. Your fresh start is you having some one-on-one alone time with God and just handing the enemy over to the king. Recognize the king, recognize the enemy, and call the enemy out in front of the king. That's the fresh start that you need maybe today. So going back to the beginning, God's people ought to recognize the enemy is around us without allowing him to be influential. I would love nothing more than for all of us to be submitted to the influence of the Holy Spirit in our lives all the time. And I understand the enemy wants to beat us up. Make decisions that prevent that from happening the best you can. Let's pray together.